You and I are about to do something that many people only dream of. Clear. And we are airborne. All right. Well, I wanted to start out with just a little bit of a kind of beauty shot. And I thought that the folks at King Schools and our video editors really did a fantastic job on that promo. And one of the things that it showed was Catalina Island, which is where we did your first flying lesson. We take our viewers on a cross-country trip for the first time, explain a little bit about the airplane, take them on a cross-country from San Diego's Montgomery Field to Catalina Island. It's a beautiful trip, and we hope to share some of the beauty of flying, but also some of the ease with which somebody can learn to fly, and we try and demystify a little bit of how the airplane operates and give them some confidence that if they choose to continue on that path, that it's not rocket science. It's something that's understandable, that they can grasp and do well with. So I wanted to start with that, and that video is available for free on our website. If you have folks that come to your flight school and are a little bit on the fence in terms of what's flying all about, and you want to just give them a quick intro, that video runs, I think it's about 30 minutes, and really does a nice job of kind of setting up the beauty of learning to fly. But we're a little bit tight on time. I had a little longer presentation. I'm going to kind of cram through it a little bit. But before we get going, one of the things that I've always been told about public speaking is you really need to start with a joke. So, I've been racking my brains, and I'm not a great jokester, to be honest with you. It's not my forte. But so I'm racking my brains. I'm talking to my wife about it and trying out different jokes on her and everything else. And unfortunately, none of them landed. So, see that's why, exactly that right there. Okay, but in any case, at least I got a chuckle out of you. Let's see if I can get this to advance. I think I might have to be closer. There we go. So the topic that I actually have three separate parts of my talk. The first one I wanted to talk about was a little bit about risk management, because it's really been core to King Schools for a long time, and primarily because of John and Martha and their desire to make an impact, to use the lessons that they learned in learning to fly, many of them the hard way, and give pilots tools that they can use in order to help manage the risk of flying. And there is risk. Of course, there's risk in everything that we do. And over time, our industry has tended to understate the risks. And because they've understated the risks, we haven't put as much attention on managing the risk of flight. Now, the new ACS, it's starting to bring that out. And that had a lot to do with John King's participation on the ARC that created the new ACS, included the risk management principles that are in the ACS. And I know that John pushed for it. He built up support on that ARC, and we came out with that being required elements in the new ACS. Some scenarios are required to be used, and they're required to consider the risk elements of each of the maneuvers. So in any case, that continues to be a mission for King Schools. I can tell you that it hasn't been a very profitable mission. And as CEO, I'm responsible for the bottom line. But we continue to really try and push out risk management every chance we get. We have 5 products at King Schools that all deal with risk management at different parts of your flight. And we have a little bit of a hard time catching pilots that have already learned to fly. They're out there, they're doing it, and to get them interested in the process of risk management. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you all today, because you have the raw material. You have folks that are coming into your flight school, and you have a couple of big advantages. One, when somebody's first learning to fly, they know that they don't know anything. So they're really open to ideas. The other thing is, you probably realize this and have experienced it, but new students tend to idolize their flight instructors. They're going to walk like their flight instructor walks, right? They're going to do whatever. They're going to buy the same headset. They're going to do everything else because they know it's a dangerous activity that they're taking on. They know it innately, and they know they need to learn it. They need to learn it well. And their flight instructor, well, they know it. They have all the knowledge that the student wants. And one of those things that they need to have, that they don't know that they need to have, is a practice of risk management, a habit, let's say, of risk management. And if the flight instructor has that and makes that habit a regular part of every flight lesson, of every interaction, that's going to transfer to the student. So I wanted to just ask you a question. How many GA accidents are there in any given year? Who knows the answer to this? Anybody in this room? That's already a little bit surprising because I didn't know either. And I had to look it up when I was making this presentation. And I found out that there's right around 1,000 accidents a year. So somebody had the right answer. They just didn't want to speak up. It was David. All right. So there's right around 1,000 a year. And approximately 200 are fatal. In my mind, that's too many. But one would be too many, and that's probably an impossible goal. But nonetheless, there's, in reality, about 200 fatal accidents a year. Now, that's 9.5 fatal accidents per million flight hours. Sounds pretty good. You know, only 9.5 per million flight hours, but in every year there's 25 million flight hours. So it still adds up. It's 14x that of driving, and that was what started the King Schools toward figuring out what we can tell students about risk management that will make a difference. Because before that, everybody was under the impression, well, they weren't under the impression, they were under the mistaken, let's say, mass hallucination that driving was the most dangerous part of getting to your flight lesson and having a flight lesson. And actually, when it comes to flight lessons, that might be true, because when students are at a flight school and taking flight lessons, they do much better than that. So, you know, one question is how many of those were related to errors in risk management or pilot error, and we'll get to that. 69% of those of the accidents were pilot related. So that kind of narrows in a little bit on things that we have control of as a training industry, right? We do a much better job when they're in training. Only 2.3 fatal accidents per million flight hours. So 2.3 goes to 9.5. So what happens when the students leave the nest? Something different happens because the accident rate changes substantially. Now, that might be partly because you have an experienced CFI on board that's going to just catch things when they come up without even necessarily active, risk surveillance and so on. And then there may be other reasons, like the training environment. It's more constricted than when somebody gets out and starts actually using an airplane to do cross-country trips and to use it in their business. So they may have acquired the skills, but they may not have developed the habit of risk management. And now we start to talk about habits. So habits are very important. And habits only come from what? From repetition, right? So we can talk about how important it is to do risk management in the ACS. They can be tested on it with the DPs that are here. And in that environment, they know they're going to be tested at it. They know the right answer to give. But in order to make it a habit, it requires repetition. And that repetition is most important if it starts right at the beginning, because there's inertia otherwise in the practice of how you approach an airplane, how you approach flying, and so on, that then is hard to overcome and change and insert something in like risk management. It really has to happen at the beginning, which means it has to happen at your flight schools. We have some ability at King Schools to do it because we have a chance to teach new students, but it's not interactive, right? Hopefully it'll be more interactive over time. I have some ideas about that, but in the meantime, there's nothing like the personal relationship between a flight instructor and a student in order to instill the practice of risk management. So the value of good habits. So, thinking about habits, one thing that came to my mind is when you get in a car today. Now, is there anybody here that remembers cars, purchasing a car, let's say, where seatbelts were optional? Okay, there's a couple. I hate to have you guys, volunteer your age, but that's what it does. It's been a little while, right? But even the ones that started driving in cars when seatbelts were optional, or even later when seatbelt might have been there but it wasn't used all the time, and then it became law. You had to have your seatbelt on, right? So we went from it being an option to it being required, and everybody started putting on their seatbelts every time they get in the car, right? So when was the last time you got in the car and you forgot to put your seatbelt on? Did anybody in the last years forgotten to put their seatbelt on? Why is that? You don't think about it, right? You just get in the car and you put the seatbelt on. So that's the value of repetition. Because you do it every time, it's associated, it's a trigger, right? You sit in the car, and that sitting in the car, a very low level of your brain, it doesn't require a lot of high level conscious thought, right? You put the seatbelt on. That's what we need in order to build really good habits of risk management. We need that kind of reaction so that it doesn't happen at the high level thinking. It happens at the low level core thinking. It's triggered. And that power, you need that kind of power to stop the momentum and the inertia that's involved in planning a flight and in executing a flight. Because everything we do from the beginning of thinking about a flight to actually flying the flight just builds inertia, right? So by the time you get to the airport, you've already invested the drive, you've invested having maybe some people come and meet you. By the time you pre-flight the airplane, now you're really ready to go. There's no reason not to go because the airplane's ready to go, right? So we need some triggers that are like putting on the seatbelt. And those triggers cause you to suddenly think, okay, I need to think about the risk. And I need to think about, I know a couple things are not quite as I planned it, but I'm going because I have the inertia behind it. So you need something that's going to break you out of that. And so that you need habits that will break you out of that. And those habits, generally, I think that the best habit is to have required briefings. And those briefings are triggered like the seatbelt. And the briefing then allows you to consider the risk associated with the flight. And this is what I would encourage in your flight school, if you're not doing it right now, to have those regular briefings and have those briefings drive a conversation, even if it's a really short conversation between the CFI and the pilot, so that when you're talking about a flight, you're not just talking about what you're going to do on the flight, but you're talking about the risks that are involved in the flight. And we have checklists. We know the checklists for that, right? Because we've had them for a while in aviation, but mostly one of the constantly recurring thought habits that's needed, that we need to be able to have it show up once in a while, is that your life is more important than making the flight, because you're never going to remember. Let's say you end up canceling a flight, and it's because weather, it's because of whatever, some risk factor, right? And you might have some disappointed passengers. You might be disappointed. You probably will be disappointed. I love to fly. I hate to cancel a flight. But in a week or two, you'll never think of it again. But the risk, on the other hand, if it's something that could turn deadly, is there is no more tomorrows. So we need to have that thought, come in, that it's actually really important. And how many folks in here, and I'm sorry to ask this question because it's a little bit of a downer, but how many of you have had somebody come through your flight school and then pass away in an airplane accident? Yeah, there's a lot of them, and I'm sure you would love to figure out how to take that student back, do something different, and have that have not happened. And there may be no silver bullet. Every accident has its own circumstances and what have you. But what we do need to do is to make sure that the students have the tools and those triggers and the habits that are needed in order to manage risk. Just like the same habits you try and instill about running checklists at certain times, right? Especially landing checklists, especially if you're doing complex retractable gear airplanes, right? You really try and instill that habit of whatever your preference is. There's a certain point, there's a trigger. You need that trigger that says, okay, gear down before landing checklist, right? So the same thing, I think the risk management needs those triggers. And the triggers are required briefings. So repetition is key. So why can a 20-hour student pilot pre-flight a 172 blindfolded, right? You could put a blindfold on them, and after they have about 30 hours, they've done, however many, 30 pre-flights, let's say, they know exactly what to do, right? You've followed them around a bunch of times and what have you. They can do that, but many can't remember what PAVE stands for. And the reason is because it's missing the repetition. The pre-flight happens every time, but PAVE, they learn it on, maybe the King School's product. They're preparing it for their test. But do they actually practice it? Do they have the repetition to think through it? And you can think through a PAVE checklist pretty darn quick. I mean, if everything is green and good to go, it's a couple minute process to go through it. But it is also a break in the momentum toward doing things the same. And I'm not saying that canceling a flight is the only option either. If you're doing a PAVE checklist and you're doing risk management, it's about mitigating the risk. The mitigation might be, I'm not going today, but it might be something else. It might be something that just takes care of whatever the issue is in a way that the risks are acceptable. They become acceptable. So briefings are a great way to get to the bottom of things. So let's take a quick look at 3 briefings that as an SOP may help to establish that habit of looking for risk. And the ones that we're going to talk about real quick are PAVE, you know what it is, we don't have to talk about it a lot. We have CORD, which is probably a new one, and then CARE. So, well, maybe there's actually 4 though, because in some ways your SOPs are a briefing as well. And I'm sure that all of your schools, most schools are 141, you have your SOPs, you have your op specs, right, that cover the operation of your flight school. And they probably cover a lot of things about when you're going to fly and when you're not going to fly and what the CFI requirements are and so on. But SOPs are so important because they form the foundation of when you're going to fly, when you're going to mitigate risk, and what you're going to do when things aren't quite right, okay? So, and one of the things that SOPs give is they give a way out for a pilot's mentality, right? So I would encourage students, and for you to have your students, develop their own SOPs. Small section of your SOP right now probably deals with the questions that pilots deal with in terms of whether or not they should fly or not. An individual pilot's SOP is going to include things like their personal minimums, right? And those are, I think of those as being the ways out, the mental ways out, because we're so goal-oriented that we need something that we can point at that is the excuse why we're not going to make that flight. I know I do. I get so goal-oriented. I'm just focused. I'm trying to get to where I'm going. If there's something standing in the way, my sense is just jump over it and go, right? And if I'm going to stop, I feel bad. I feel like, I'm a failure. I would plan this flight and I'm not going. It's, I've failed. What I need is something that I can point to and say, so that I can even tell my passengers, love to go fly today, but unfortunately we have standard operating procedures which are for all of our safety, and that says we can't go. So it's not just, I'm not feeling it, you have something concrete that you can point to. And I would encourage you to have your students develop their own SOPs, which starts with really the personal minimums. But it might talk about pre-flight procedures, call-outs that they're going to make, CRM, SOP, single pilot resource management, and so on. Even things like, what do I do on a loss of power on takeoff, which I think is a great one. We're going to come back to that in just a second. But the idea is that the briefings will be performed before and during the flight. So SOPs are the core. And then about PAVE. So PAVE is a great way to structure a discussion, either a discussion with yourself or a discussion with the flight instructor. You start with a discussion with the flight instructor, and hopefully then that'll carry over. So because of habit, repetition, and so on, that becomes a discussion that the pilot has with themselves before they go out and pre-flight the airplane. Because remember that incremental commitment. You just get more and more committed as you go, more inertia. So doing PAVE before you've pre-flighted the airplane already puts you in a position to make changes that are a little bit easier to make without changing the flow. So what? It's pilot, aircraft, environment, external pressures. I'm not going to go into those because I think you know those very well. The other one that you may or may not be doing right now is a pre-takeoff brief. And this is something that comes from John and Martha. It comes from our SOPs when we're flying the Falcon, in that there's a checklist item on our checklist, as there is for most high performance and jet aircraft, that says captain brief, right? So this is where the captain gets to say something. Gets to say something hopefully important that keeps the crew together and keeps them on the same page as they get ready to depart. And what we've come up with is CORD. And that's conditions, where you talk about the airport, runway conditions, current ATIS. These are the important things. These are not the things in the SOP. These are the things that change from flight to flight. They can be different from flight to flight. And you want to consider them. Just go through and think about it. Airport, runway conditions, current ATIS, hazards. What kind of hazards are we facing? Those can be things like strong winds, a slick runway, rising terrain in the area, that you want to know where it is in case you get really busy handling an emergency. You want to know which way you can go. Relevant NOTAMs for the airport, and so on. And then any operational changes. Now, operational changes are differences from your SOP. Things that you want to do differently in order to ensure a safe departure, right? So those might be things like flap settings, initial climb speed because of a mountain or because of this or that. Anti-ice, if you have it, delayed rotation because of maybe wind shear in the area and so on. You want to get a little bit more speed before you take off. You consider your runway length and so on. So that's all operational considerations. And then the runway, required versus available. And things that you might think about even at the primary level are things like speed timing. So I don't know if any of you do this, but a Cessna 172, how long does it take to accelerate to liftoff speed, right? And it's pretty easy to start a timer. It's required to be in the airplane. So you could start a timer and have an SOP that, if you're not off by X number of seconds, then you're going to abort and stop, right? Or you've chosen an abort by point. So those are ways to check, that the engine is not performing as it should. The airplane's not performing as it should. And then return and departure. But the point is that a checklist like this gives you the opportunity to stop, take a breath, take a look at the situation before you depart. And so I think that's really good, and it beats some of the end of the runway checklists that we have. Like if you're flying a multi-engine aircraft, almost everybody, they get to the end of the runway, at least with the flight instructor, and what do? They recite the single, if you lose an engine, what are you going to do? Mixtures, props, throttles, forward, flaps up, gear up, identify, verify, feather, and maintain blue line, right? So you state that every time, but that's not the important thing. That's the SOP. You should talk about that, make sure that they've memorized it on the ground, but when you're at the end of the runway, the question is, what's in our environment today? What's different today? What do we have to do in order to mitigate the risk of this departure? Okay, so that's another brief. CARE is the other one. I think everybody here is familiar with consequences, alternatives, reality, external pressure. A great example of this is a recent, and that's one of the reasons I showed Catalina. How many of you are familiar with the accident in Catalina just recently? So it's really an interesting one to look at, because I think it really demonstrates this idea of inertia and not really taking a break or not having a trigger that causes you to really take a look at the overall situation. And I have no idea what the pilots were thinking. I only know about the facts of the accident that then TSB is released. And you have a situation where you have a flight instructor, 2 students stranded, call for help. They dispatched an airplane to come pick them up. Twin engine aircraft. They had trouble starting one of the engines. They had to get special permission even to land because they were landing after the airport was closed. The airport manager said, yes, you can land, but you got to be out of here before sunset. He knew the airport. There was a good reason why he wanted them to be out of there before sunset. There's no runway lights is the biggest reason. So in any case, they finally get the Beechcraft, I think it was a Traveler, they get both engines running. Meanwhile, it's gotten dark. The airport manager reiterates that they're not approved for takeoff, and they said, well, we're going to take off anyway. And he said, well, I can't stop you, but I advise against it. So there's a pretty good clue there that this may not be the best idea, but they decided to do it anyway. And I'm not sure, nobody knows what they were thinking, but if you stopped and went through that CORD checklist that I just showed, and you talked about conditions and so on, one of the things about Catalina Airport is they were taking off to the west. What do you think's west of Catalina Airport? It's on the west coast, island off of the west coast. What's west of there? Yeah, Japan. That's right. It's a black hole. There's not one light. There's nothing out there, right? And you've got an airport that's 1,602 feet off the water, steep sloping terrain on both sides down to the water. All as we know is that they got airborne about midfield and started a descent and a right turn and descended into terrain and crashed. We don't know if they had an engine problem or what have you, but I could imagine sitting at the end of the runway going through the CORD checklist and having a couple of very interesting discussions. I'm not saying that they should or shouldn't have gone, but I think some of the discussion probably, if I were doing it, would have centered around, it's a black hole out there. We're gonna and we don't have runway lights, so our landing light and taxi lights working. Am I going to be able to see the runway? If we pull out, we start the takeoff run, I can't see the runway, I'm going to abort. You just go through and start talking about those things. When we lift off, I'm on instruments, basically. And since I've got other pilots on board, why don't you watch my attitude indicator? If you see any deviation from, about 7 degrees pitch up, then tell me. And so I might be asking for support from crew resource management there. And I'm not by any means advocating that I should go, but if I'm going to go, I'm going to mitigate the risk however I can, right? But I think that there one of the problems of Catalina is that there's no place to stay, and there's no taxi service after 5 o'clock at night. You can't just call somebody to come up to the airport and pick you up and drive you to town. So they would have been stuck there, probably sleeping on a couch at the FBO, and so there were some reasons why they might have felt some urgency to go back. My point is that I don't know if there was a break in their momentum to get home. They'd been delayed and so on, high external pressures. If we can develop the habit of thinking about what are the risks and how can I mitigate them? If I'm going to go, what can I do to make it a safer departure? That then we're doing our jobs. If we're teaching that as flight instructors and instilling that habit of risk surveillance and mitigation, I think we can even make a greater impact in number of accidents, and especially the number of fatal accidents per year. So many of them, if you read a lot of accident reports like I do, you start to recognize and see that chain happening, and you don't see you see opportunities for it to break, but they don't happen. So I'd like to see those chains broken. Okay, I'm running out of time here. So I had a takeaway. What was it? Repetition is the key to developing any habit, including learning to find and mitigate risk. It takes repetition, and that repetition has to start. And also because of the law of primacy, it's best if it starts at the very first part of training. The habit of risk management creates a mental discipline that, once developed, can trigger the thought that shines a light on the mistake you're about to make. And that's what we really want. We want to see things a little bit further ahead. And it's like learning to fly higher performance airplanes, right? We were talking the other day and thought, some people think that the faster the airplane goes, that the faster you have to think and the faster you have to take actions. And boy, that's going to be hard when I upgrade to that airplane, because I'm going to have to move faster. But it's not about moving faster. It's about being further ahead in your thinking. It's about planning. And we want to move people further ahead in their thinking. And that's what shining that light on the mistake you're about to make is all about. Okay, this one's going to be very quick, and I'm going to skip through a lot of it. But wow. Sorry about that. I didn't realize it was going to be that loud. But and it jumped way ahead. Okay, so that slide was just showing me being a beginner again. I just recently had the opportunity to learn to fly helicopters, and it was the most wonderful experience that I think I've had in my flying career. But it required me to go back to being a beginner. And going back to being a beginner is a beautiful thing. I love it. I love to be a beginner at things and learn new things, but it's hard. And it seems to get harder as I get older. I'm not sure why that is. But in any case, it made me thoughtful about the beginning process. What you saw right there was my first solo. And one of the things that I thought about as I was picking up that helicopter for the first time all by myself without anybody in the aircraft with me was, if I had tried to do this just 3-4 weeks before, it would have been a suicide mission. I mean, there is no way in the world that I could have successfully picked that helicopter and put it back down. And it made me thoughtful about the learning process and about how we learn and how we can optimize our learning, because I thought that was a wonderful thing to go back and have that feeling that our students have again, that sense of accomplishment and so on. But not all students get there as easily as they could. Sometimes their mind gets in their way, gets too involved. And this is a list of what I would see as an ideal student who showed up for me, right? They're excited about what they were learning. They're full of questions, deep curiosity, no preconceived notions, soaked up everything like a sponge. If they didn't know something, they didn't fake it. They laughed about their foolishness, able to correlate ideas. How many people have had that student? You've probably had a couple of them, right? Wow. What if they could all be like that? Wouldn't it be wonderful? Many students have trouble. Their mind gets in the way. And I think that as a flight instructor, one of our responsibilities, one of our responsibilities is to help our students learn. It's in the FOI, right? It's all about helping our students learn. So teaching learning pilots how to approach their learning is one way to manage the risk of them not becoming a pilot, of them leaving your flight school, of just suddenly not showing up one day and then next week, and suddenly you realize, well, where'd that person go that was so excited about learning to fly, and they're gone, right? And we talked earlier what the dropout rate was. It's unacceptably high. There's something that happens that we lose people that are just passionate about wanting to learn to fly, but their mind's getting in the way. And I think very often it's not financial. It's not the excuses that you hear. It's they've lost confidence in their ability to learn. And what can we do to help them? Well, one of the things, going back to starting off on the right foot, is another briefing. What if we could give them a briefing at the very beginning, at the first day they show up to the flight school, the first lesson, that would help them throughout their entire process with you and might help retain them? And what I'm going to ask you to do for just a moment, and I think we have just a moment, is to close your eyes for one moment. And I'm going to ask you to put yourself in the position of a brand new student showing up for your first lesson at a flight school. And you show up, your CFI sits you down, imagine yourself in a conference room, and the CFI tells you this. So they say, you know, you're setting out on a great adventure, and I want to help you stay excited about what you're doing. If at any point you're not feeling it, let's talk about it. Be curious and full of questions. I'm here to help you learn. And if I don't know something, I'll find out. Don't be afraid to ask. There's no bad questions except the ones you don't ask. Avoid preconceived notions and try to be open to absorb everything. Ask me to slow down if things are going too quickly. You won't find any judgment here. If you don't know something, don't fake it. Just ask. And if you're like me, you'll need to hear things many times to remember them. Don't be embarrassed or concerned to fail a few times before succeeding. Everybody does. If you're not feeling, or if you are feeling frustrated and learning's becoming difficult, you may want to consider what it means to have a beginner's mind. So how would you feel if your instructor gave you that briefing? That was the first thing that they told you. Right? You'd feel like you have somebody here, you have a friend, you have somebody that's going to help you, that wants you to succeed, and it is going to help you if you have any trouble or what have you, and doesn't have expectations of you that are going to cause you to feel badly at any point in your training. No matter what you do, you have somebody that's going to support you. So my suggestion is that we have our flight instructors and that we ourselves give students a briefing about how to learn. Now, I don't have time to give it, but I have the rest of this presentation talks about the idea of a beginner's mind. And you can look it up online and think about what it means to you and how much you would want to talk to a student about this idea of a beginner's mind. But I think it gives a good guidance in terms of being a serial beginner. If you want to begin and begin again and begin again and begin again and learn things in your life, it's worthwhile to spend a little bit of time thinking about how you approach learning, how you respond to difficult times in the learning process. And the beginner's mind may give you some guidance on that. So this is the classic quote. In the beginner's mind, there's many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there's few. And one of the most important things about being a beginner is avoiding being an expert. Once you've become an expert, you're pretty much shutting down more learning, right? Because you know it all. So that's really what the beginner's mind is about. I'm sorry I don't have time to go into some of the things that I was going to cover about what's going on at King Schools, but you hear about us. You hear from the team at King Schools about things that are going. So what I'd like to do is ask you one question, and that is, how did we do? Teaching's our passion, and after 50 years, we're just getting started. Helping you and your customers succeed is really what drives us. And we strive to think like beginners, so we value your feedback. We want to learn. We're a learning organization. We want to learn what your needs are, what we could do for you that would make you more successful, because that's what makes us successful. Not only in our minds, but makes us successful in every way. So how was this? How was the cruise? Was it good? All right. Would you come back next year? Yeah? All right. Well, we appreciate the amount of time and the significant commitment you made to come here. And not only that, but to show up in this room for these 2 full days when we're sitting on a cruise ship that's just full of other things that you could be doing with your time. So we hope that that was a good trade for you and that you got a lot of value from the presentations. I'd like to thank the presenters for the effort that they put into their presentations and giving you hopefully some tools that you can take back. I'd like to thank the vendors for their support, and I hope that you had a chance to connect with them and them with you. I'd like to thank the King Schools team that came here, and I hope that you had the chance to connect with them and spend some time. And I wish you all a very good trip back home, and we hope to see you next year. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Barry.